One of the things I've really learned in Builder, what you read is rarely what happened. There was this whole news around round tripping. The rubbish about there were apparently 700 people pretending to be an AI, and I don't read the headlines anymore. Because usually, if there's going to be any truth, it's going to be buried somewhere in the middle or in the bottom. When the narrative gets ahead of the truth, you no longer control the narrative. It's an impossible battle. I know the mistakes I made, but they're not the ones being written in the newspaper. I think the thing that to me was the hardest was...
Sachin Dev Duggal built one of tech's most controversial AI companies in recent years.
And now he's revealing what the headlines missed.
And how you can avoid making the same mistakes he did.
In the early days, we grew, and we grew too fast. Huge mistake. We went from $400,000 a month to a few million a month. It felt like a split second. And so the problem is, when you become a company of that size so fast, it's virtually impossible to check every single thing. And so when we needed a break, I don't think I was firm enough that we needed a break. And the conventional wisdom was you delegate and then, people will deal with it. The problem is that I put the wrong emphasis on trust. There were people we should have let go of. And I'd say the straw that broke the camel's back was the noise. The nonsense around round tripping, the rubbish around the India situation. Do I think we ever shook that cloud off? No. But what I did learn is that it's all about being relentless. And no one sees that. No article's writing that. Anxiety is such an important thing to manage for a founder. And the big takeaway for me was...
Sachin, this is your first public interview since everything has happened with Builder.ai. And I'm sure a lot has happened in that time. So a big thank you for being here today and excited to find out more about the story and what you're up to next.
Amazing. Well, Ollie, thank you for the invite. Really nice to be here. I think 2025 was quite the year. One of the things that I sort of definitely said to myself is in 26, I'm going to be much more focused around the things that really matter. And so I'm really, really, really good to be here.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again. Some of the audience might be wondering, why is Sachin here? And I think in these situations, it's always really important and fair for founders to come onto shows like this with a big audience to share their story, because there will be founders out there who may repeat similar mistakes, right? And I think it's only fair that we give, people a chance and people like you to come onto the show and, share all the learnings you've been through. So a big thank you again. But I have to ask first, 2025, like you mentioned, it was probably an up and down year. How are you feeling now, almost 12 months on to the day?
I guess, Ollie, the thing that really matters to me, just as sort of by way of background, I did the Vipassana about, it must have been about 7-8 years ago. And so it's the 10 days of silent meditation. And I think my 2025 would have been very different had I not done it. There are sort of like some really important lessons that you pick up from sport. I've picked up from tennis that have sort of, helped me understand where I am. Right? So one of the most important things is winning is not controlling the outcome, because you realize very quickly you can't control the outcome. Winning is controlling your inputs. You go on a tennis court. No tennis player in the ATP ever says, I got to win this match, because you create anxiety almost right off the bat. And 25 taught me that more than anything in abundance. The second thing is you got to be able to sleep well at night, which means you have an internal truth that you sleep with. And by and large, I slept okay through 25. And I think that is, for me, an important sanity check, a litmus check. Not for any other reason that those are the things you can't hide behind. And I'd say the very last one, which to me gives me a lot of, gives me a lot of faith and energy and focus, is you can mortgage many things, but you can't mortgage someone's mind. And, as I thought about this conversation and a couple of others that I'm starting to have, what also became really clear to me, and it was sort of inspired by this book I've been reading by Mel Robinson called Let Them. And it's like, well, I'm not here asking for redemption or a redemption arc. I'm really here to be asked to be held to a higher standard, and to be judged by what I do next. It's hard to control the narratives that come out. So the only narrative you can control is the one that happened, the one you saw, the one you experienced. And so, yeah, I think 25 was a year. You could look at it as it was a tough year, but it was also a year of learning a lot of lessons, learning a lot of new skills. It was also a great filtering exercise. I was talking to a friend of mine this afternoon, and you very quickly realize who are all weather and who are good weather and who are even slight weather friends, and people that'll be around. And you don't realize that till when the shit really hits the fan. And then you start to see and experience, how so much of people's way of history or looking at history is subject to, I call it selective amnesia. Right? And it's fine. Again, it's I can't control the outcome. And that's actually what's probably given me the most peace.
I like that a lot. And when you said, who do you call in those difficult times? You really know who your true friends are. When you called some of your friends during those difficult times, how did they help you through the whole process and through the last 12 months?
I think, and it was some of the friends that I probably least expected. Some of the staple ones you obviously expect, right? Like my best friend, gave me a lecture and spoke to me at the same time, but then that's been our relationship for 20 years. And there were other friends, and what was nice? It was, I remember this book that a very dear friend of mine is a prolific tennis coach, had told me. He said, it's The Rabbit That Listened. And it's a children's book. And I remember reading it out to a bunch of the Builder team as well. And it's all about the real coach or the real friend or the real support is not the person that fixes your problem. They kind of just come sit next to you, give you a bit of warmth, and they're just a sponge for whatever you want to say. And it might be, by the way, you don't see a lot. And that's also perfectly fine. So, I think that was, to me, the big thing. It was folks that were just there. And knowing that they were there as a sound. Like some of them were a sounding board. Some of them spoke to them every day. Some of them I met them once a week for lunch or something or the other, and they were just there. And, the interesting thing was no one wanted to have a conversation that I didn't want to have, which to me was really important because then they were there for the right reasons.
I think it's really important to have those friends in life, but it's really important also to trust those friends. How do you trust them?
Trust is a very big word in my life. And more so because, and I'm still, this is the truth I'm still fighting with. My innate behavior was you trust everyone and you let them lose it. And it was just because it was simpler for me to process. It has less gates, right? It's and I'm sort of very binary. Am I like a 1 million% there, or I'm just not there? I find it very hard to deal in the gray because I feel like you're trading, and I don't think you trade in these things. I think the tough part with trust, especially with that mindset, is that you've got to be a much better judge, which I wasn't, of who to trust. That being said, I think I did a good job with my friends in the last year. And a lot of it was, I think, came down to something I said earlier on, which is sometimes they just didn't want to have a conversation. They just wanted to be there. And, there was no agenda. And some of my Emirati friends, they really dug deep to just be there. So it'd be like, even if something happened, unfortunately, my mom had got into hospital, and they're like, well, we want to come and see her. And, to me, that was both very warming, but also made, when the rest of the world just seems really bleak, and then you see people's response like that, it actually shape shifts how you reevaluate. And then so I went through this whole curve of like, well, trust no one. And then, came back to my original thought, well, no, you must trust everyone in the beginning, but you've got to have your gates correctly organized. And the only way you don't know your gates aren't correctly organized is because something went wrong with them at some point, right? Otherwise, we don't learn if we don't make mistakes, or if we don't have a failure, or if we don't have something that goes wrong. And the art of giving trust in itself is subject to a lot of faux pas, and you learn how to deal with them.
Like we said earlier, it's always super important, right, to have all those amazing friends through amazing times, good times, shit times. And we're going to come on to this because, again, I'm really excited for today's chat, and hopefully it's going to be really honest, because so many founders out there want to hear stories like this, and it's important we share them. But I'd actually like to go back to the really early beginnings. Sachin's growing up. I read through all of your interviews, I think, that you're a bit of an entrepreneur from an early age. Take us back to when Sachin was growing up.
So, so both my parents, had small businesses. My mom was a fashion designer, but I, really, it wasn't something that, there was a lot of discussion on the dining table, but it wasn't something that if you asked me when I was 12, what do you want to be? It's not, entrepreneur was not one of those. I wanted to be a pilot and then eventually wanted to be a tennis player. And sort of the entry into tech was because I blew up my mom's computer, and she said, fix it or else. I was 14. And that's when I learned how to program DOS by reading a book. There was no language models then. And, I got the DOS menu system working, and I was like, oh, this is actually quite interesting. Like, this thing does what I tell it to do, and it does it every single time. And I remember my birthday was coming up, and I wanted my own computer. My mom said, listen, for the last one. I say, no, but I'll go buy the parts and make it because it's a lot cheaper. I bought the parts. It didn't work. I was in tears. Went back to the computer store, this time with my mom. And the guy was like, could see me, and then he said, like, next time, don't forget this. The red line means pin 1 on the motherboard. Switch the ribbon around, put it on, everything came online. And, small lesson in life, like, never forget the red line means pin 1 if you're ever building hardware. But, it gave me this sense of like, well, hang on a second, like there's a huge arbitrage here, right? Between the cost of the components, my time, plus what you were buying a Packard Bell or something at that point for. And to me, everything equated to tennis lessons. So I was like, well, if I sell one PC, I get 5 tennis lessons, or 3 tennis lessons. And so, I sort of teamed up with my best friend in school, and we started building PCs. And actually, my first customer was my design teacher. And he didn't want to build a PC, he just wanted his laptop repaired because it wasn't powering up. And I remember ringing out the manufacturer, being relentless, and eventually just ordered him a new charger. And his laptop started working. And he was like the happiest person because no one had sorted this problem out for him. And sort of, went from there, and then started to write code, learn how to build software, all sort of pretty organic and interest-based, right? But for many years, until I stopped playing tennis, or stopped wanting to play tennis seriously, which was about 16, it all equated down to number of tennis lessons or tennis equipment.
Okay, interesting. Tennis. Where do you think the DNA of actually becoming a founder came from? Is it just from sports? Why did you actually want to become that entrepreneur?
I don't think you ever want to become an entrepreneur, by the way. I think you want to solve a problem. I think you want freedom on how to solve that problem. I think you want, sometimes it's not the mainly it's never the main reason, but you definitely want the economics of solving the problem because it lets you solve more problems, right? But, entrepreneurs are tinkerers for all intents and purposes. The other part of it is they're singles tennis players. Because, the overlap. So this is written, I love reading. So there's another really interesting book. It's called The Inner Game of Tennis by Tim Galway. It's an insanely good book. And, one of the things that both reading that book, I read, Agassi's book. And then when I used to play, you used to have a sort of sports psychologist, even more recently, whenever I've gone to the academy. And, it goes down to sort of like some really interesting crucible thoughts that are very similar to entrepreneurship. And so one of them is, there are three things that happen, because tennis is a very lonely sport. So there are three things that happen, call them the pyramid of three muscles. The first muscle is physicality, right? Your energy, your stamina. That's usually the first to go. Above stamina is strategy. So as stamina or energy or you get tired starts to go, the next thing that follows is strategy, because you start to make alternate strategy decisions that are suboptimal because your legs aren't going to carry you. Then much, much, much later, heart goes, because you run out of strategy, you're exhausted, but your heart stays. It's the longest. You see this in the greats, Novak, Nadal, Andy Murray, famously would just be like running his legs out, but he would still turn around and win. What was interesting is when the heart goes, all three go. You can't have no heart and be playing great. And so I think that was one. I think the second one was define winning. Right? It's controlling the things you control, because otherwise you can never win. So in tennis, it's like, did I do a split step? Did I hit the ball forward? Was I keeping my feet moving? Happy feet. And the third one, which again, I think is a huge parallel to entrepreneurship, is my tennis coach says, it's like space is pace and slow is fast. And so space is pace on a court, right, is more about like, you don't need to keep smacking the ball and fighting with it to hit the baseline at 200 miles an hour. Sometimes the best is just to place it really in a nice place, and it will build its own pace because you're getting the person to move. Similarly, if you see some of the greatest tennis players, it looks like they're playing in slow motion, like Federer. And it's because they're hitting the ball at the right place. Now you take all these parallels you apply to entrepreneurship or to building a business. It's the same thing. The only thing you can control is what you input. Can't control the customer, can't control the outcome, can't control the valuation, can't control the fundraise. And I think the other part of it is it's super lonely. Can't speak to a lot of people. And what I also realized was that when you say X, when you're 5 people, 20 people, 100 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, what you say is X fundamentally means something different. And as you get bigger, and I realized this the other week when I was speaking to an old colleague, he said, Sachin, when I joined, someone said, don't ever disagree with Sachin. I said, well, that's so silly. He's like, and we were sitting in this meeting last week or 2 weeks last week. And he said, yeah, but I've just realized it's quite easy to disagree with you. And then you'll have a rational discussion. I'm like, I don't know why someone told you that. And then I realized that, you become the bear that everyone uses to hide their own bugs. But no one tells you that. Like there's no like a guidebook which tells you like you should be aware of this or you should know this. And so that is all, that journey of entrepreneurship is like you're really dealing with all these muscles. The profit part is the fun part.
It's exciting, right? And like all great entrepreneurs, they all have so many ideas and so many different focuses. But if we fast forward to 2016, we're talking about tennis. So this is probably one of your first tournaments, right? One of your first serves. 2016 happens, and I remember at the time, this is around the time of all the no-code, low-code tools kind of like cropping up, right? And I vaguely remember when Builder first launched. But what was the initial idea for Builder? Let's jump onto that. What was the initial idea for Builder, and what did you really set out to build?
So Builder started with a very simple observation, which was that too many ideas were dying at the intersection between vision and built product. And, you had all of this low code, no code, which kind of felt like a forced set of tools. But in the end, what you started to see was all these tools, you needed 10 times the amount of human experts to customize them. If you looked at all the CRM systems, if you looked at all of the no-code, low-code tools, they all said, oh, you can now, like, it's a citizen developer. I remember this whole conversation, like the citizen in an organization or the person at home, but then you couldn't, right? I mean, I remember we used to use a well-known CRM system and shit, like we'd spend 7 times the subscription fee in experts a year customizing it. We were engineers. And so what became really clear to me was how do you allow people to build bespoke software? We were really interested in this idea of now what's called reconstructible AI, but we called it reusable features, but effectively reusable atomic units. And the analogy, which I think is going to be the analogy for AI in 26 and 27 is, Lego ships 4 billion pieces a year. There's only about 3,600 unique pieces. Everything is built on the 3,600. And when you look at those Lego blocks across all the Lego sets, it's a linear decay curve, right? So the top 30% of all Lego blocks, they probably come from a basket size of like 20 Lego blocks, 30 Lego blocks. The next 30% will be like, I don't know, 100 or 200, 300. And then there's a very long tail. And software had the same thing, right? When you looked at all software applications and you deconstructed it. And this to me was the eureka moment. And to be honest, that eureka moment was somewhat of a serendipitous one for us, because we started with the intent that you would get teams to help you build something. And then we got an inbound from this business school that had sort of got a grapple of what we were looking at. And they're like, we'd love to do a free research project. And so we said, we think there's a there here with features. They're like, no, there's an absolute there. So this entire research, we're going to say, nobody wants teams. People want features. And so that to me was like this unlock where we realized suddenly, you know what, like if we get this reusable feature stuff right, then around the edges, whether you use human experts or eventually you generate, that work will become smaller and smaller. And the beauty was we were building a platform that provided oxygen to entrepreneurs. And it came from hearing all the sob stories of all my friends that were now trying to build software or apps and so on and so forth and getting rogered in the process. And today we call this architecture neurosymbolic. And you know what? The interesting thing is, in 2016, it didn't have a name. And that's fascinating to me, right? Because, you were, what we were doing was so far ahead of the bandwagon. And that makes it so powerful.
And this is like, again, 2016, 2017, AI wasn't really a thing. Some people were talking about it, but it's very much like this kind of low code, no code type of tools, kind of scrappy together, right?
You're absolutely right. And I remember our Series A slide deck, and it had like, I think I can't remember, it was 8 or 10 bubbles. And it said, here's a 10-step journey. And, we're only here right now, but here's what we're going to do and build with the AI and reusable features and the code generation and how they're all going to fit in together. But it was grounded on this one really important truth for us, which is reuse trumps what does the generation. And so what do I mean by that, right? The view was, if you use login, if you have a login feature, it's going to be the same login feature. 80% of the feature is going to be the same no matter where you use it. It's going to be like the customization that will change. The customization was generation. In the beginning, we had, even all the way through, but in the beginning, it was much more human customization, and we were working to automate some of that customization using both sort of classical software engineering and also generative AI. And when we started and when we filed our patents, I think it was 2018, actually 2017 we filed it, 2019 we got it granted. This was all written. This was our plan. Like, this is what we were going to do. And at that point, people were giving you wizards to do WYSIWYG editors. And so it was very, very different.
It's amazing to see just how far the categories evolved, right? To where we are today. It's insane. If you think ChatGPT, right, it's 1,000 days old, November the 30th, 22. It's crazy. And it's only going to get bigger, right? One of my questions later will be, if Builder.ai was launching today, would it be, a slightly different story? But we'll come on to that. Let's just go back a little bit. Okay, so it's 2016, Builder's launch. Take me inside the company. Imagine I'm joining as an intern today. What's happening inside the company? It's his first year.
Yeah, so we're 20 people. We basically sit around a table. And so version 0 of Builder, which was then called something else, was built in 5 days. It was 10 days before of thinking, brainstorming, brainstorming. But then there was this event coming up. And we're like, we'll put it in front of an event, people, and we'll get feedback. So I remember it was me. There was this really solid engineer, Siddhant, who then went to start an AI QA company. Siddhant and Priyanka and a few others. And we basically solidly worked for 5 days, iterating before we got this inspiration from this business plan, business school students to change it to features. And what we realized was in that first launch, we realized something really, really important, which was the way people explained what they wanted to do referenced what was already out there. So I want to build an app like Uber that does this, but for babysitters, right? And that vernacular was consistent. If you spoke to someone that wasn't technical, wholly consistent. You spoke to even like a non-technical person within an enterprise, wholly consistent. It always started with this. In some mix, it was like, I want to build something like this and a bit of that, and I like this. And it kind of made sense because if you're not an expert, you pick what you can reference. And it's like when you're planning your house or anything, you'll look at inspirations of things that you've seen. And so it was chaotic, but it was like lightning speed. We were iterating by the hour as we were getting feedback and making changes. And then we got this really good feedback after the event, what resonated, what didn't resonate. And for the first couple of years, we were like 20, 30 people. And we would all sit around and we did whatever we could sell so that we could bootstrap as long as possible, because we didn't raise a round till the end of 2018. Middle of 2018, we did the seed, end of 2018. We made all the decisions around, well, what gives us cash, kind of hardcore core entrepreneurship. And it was a great time because we made trade decisions around, well, can do that, we can't do this. I would also say that, the difficult part of that is you couldn't do long-term planning. What you were really doing is breaking anything long-term into little pieces, but some things just needed more oomph and time and so on and so forth, especially in 2016, 2017, when, BERT was just about to be launched, and that was the original transformer model. We were doing like early classical AI elements, right? So as we got towards sort of like 2017, 2018, we started to do things like the first embeddings. We were converting, words into vectors, which is effectively what language models are, on a much more sort of glorified state. We were starting to draw out what the whole platform was going to look like and how it was going to feel. So as an intern coming in, there really wasn't an intern's role. Like you were given something really meaningful and like, go run with it. Come back when it's done. You were all working in a group and it was completely flat. So we all sat around with each other and we all did whatever we need to do, which is not too dissimilar to how, we're doing stuff at Second Brain. We all do whatever we need to do. It's like, effectively got mini CEOs running around owning a part of the stack. And we sort of learn how to draw out and carve out the map so that everyone does the right piece.
And I'm imagining super chaotic. Like when I speak to a lot of these AI companies today and founders, a lot of them say, if you want a 9 to 5 job, do not work here. It's like 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, right? Hyper chaotic. being chaotic, but also just trying to find those first customers. So you have your first product, and maybe for a bit more context for the viewers, right? So Builder.ai's first product was basically similar to like the vibe coding tools today, right? You try and build a product, you want to clone a website, and then hopefully it has it, right?
Yeah, and I think the difference to vibe coding is that, we were still, our audience was really not technical. So they probably couldn't even describe you what they wanted in proper detail, which is why we used to have like these human touch points to make sure that we didn't mess up the customer experience because we hadn't yet finished building parts of the tech. Right. And then we were learning from each interaction in each build so that we could get our head around all the edge cases.
It's similar somewhat, right, to the vibe coding tools today, when a lot of these technical people might not quite know what they want, but it's pretty magical. But take us through the first product. How are you finding your first 1,000 customers? Is this the typical, type of startup? You're going on product hunt, you're going to all the events, you're DMing like as many people as you can on X or Twitter back then, I guess it was. How are you finding those, first few thousand customers?
Well, not too dissimilar to how we're doing it now, to be honest. I'd say is that, we had a rubric of what we thought was the ideal workload.
Yeah.
And it was a loosey-loo rubric because, you make it too tight, you won't find anyone. And we kind of said, like, for as long as we can get parts of this, and each thing, and I think the thing I've learned between now and then is each thing we do must compound. If we're not compounding, means we're repeating. And we're not building velocity naturally. Right. And then you end up having to do forced velocity. So we were ringing everyone, going to events, trying inbound, you name it, we tried it. How we got folks in. And then what we were doing was basically trying to say, well, we built this and we got these features. Now, can we go find something else that we can use these features for? And that was sort of the essence. So we were effectively like manually spinning the flywheel to try and prove the thesis that, if you got to like a few hundred features, you covered the gambit of software. And that was a really important thesis to get right because it proved the reusability perspective of it. Now, I think in the early days, we probably did a slightly better job of making sure we stuck to that. I think as we grew and we grew too fast, which I think is an important mistake. It's important that we recognize that mistake, my mistake. Is that growing fast meant in the pursuit of velocity, we couldn't have the lines in the sand that we needed to reposition stuff that's already been built. Now, later on, obviously, we institutionalized it. But, it's like turning a jet ski versus turning a cruise liner. When you're at very high velocity, because then you're having to worry about, and this I think is the quid pro quo of bootstrapping, is you have to worry about the customers. And so because you're worrying about the customers, the speed at which you can iterate and change, if you care about the customer, slows down as the volume of customers increases, right? Or you need to have parallel platforms running and you transition through. So the complexity increases. And so that's also, an interesting, you sort of think about the differences between what we're doing now and what we did then. We're being really mindful of not growing too many customers. We're being really mindful of how much work is actually needed for a verticalized solution and so on and so forth. Because the risk is you eat away the hours of core brain time you have as a team to build core platform. And the more you push that out, especially in the world we're in now, velocity gets ahead of you.
Completely. And, especially like in a tech world where we are today, everything is super chaotic. Everything's moving so fast, right? But back then it was still like super, super early. And, I imagine it's super chaotic, but also super exciting. 2016, 2017, so many amazing companies were launching at this stage. And if you were raising big rounds, I can't remember all of them. But I read one of your, or I watched one of your Bloomberg interviews, and I thought it was really interesting because you said, I don't want to be a $1 billion company or become a unicorn. I want to become a $1 trillion company. What was the initial vision for building Builder AI back when you were launching in 2016? What was that big vision?
I think for us, for me, it was specifically that there was a recognition that not so distant in the future, people would have personal software. And
wow. Even back then, because like now is like, it's true, right? But back then it just wasn't really a thing.
So my belief for people would have personal software. It would be just for them, maybe. Now, you're not going to get that if you have to spend $500,000 to build something. And so the question is how would you allow people that are not technical to have software that just helped them, whether it was classical or AI? The reason for the $1 trillion was it forced us to think about scale. And so we had done this math backwards, right? How many applications a month, how many applications an hour? Okay, so if we need to get to this many applications an hour, how do we progress between now and the next 7 years or 10 years or whatever the time frame was to get to that many applications an hour? And then the hour metric became everything we were doing was like, well, how does it affect the applications per hour? So, whether it's ordering, lead, conversion. Another key piece in that whole thing, right, especially when you're dealing with non-technical folks, was magic. Was how do you deliver magic to the customer? And so what do I mean by that? If you imagine a customer that doesn't have domain expertise in something, let's just say doesn't know how to build software, they're actually fighting two fears. Usually there's a fear of irrelevance. It's also a sine wave. And the exact opposite of that sine wave, so starting from the trough, is the fear of failure. So why do they start the journey of building something? Fear of irrelevance. Why do they stop? Fear of failure. And there are two waves that go like this. So when one is up, one is down. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to create escape velocity. So they're outside of both the fears. They're like above the curves. And the way you do that is by delivering them moments of magic. Because what happens with someone that doesn't have the subject matter expertise is they're entirely emotionally led. And so if you can give them moments of excitement, a visual, something they can see, something that gives them confidence you've understood, something they can play with, what you're really doing is you're breaking it all into bite-sized steps. And that means you keep them high and energized. And what you noticed in software was that you could do that in the beginning. But then when it came to the building part, because it used to take so long, people would have an instant crash because they weren't seeing something for weeks or months. And so the goal really in that vision, if you're going to help people to build personal software, is like, how do you cram that? How do you make it so fast? Or you keep delivering moments of excitement in the middle. So prototyping for us, as an example, was exactly that. So, well, how can we generate your prototype before you pay? Even if it's like slightly wrong. Because we realized the minute we could show you the storyboard and you'd already had this rich conversation, we had pushed you to such a high level of energy that there was enough patience now to let the build. So it ended up becoming, us building a software platform, but spending a lot of time on trying to understand human psychology of how they react, because we weren't selling to a technical buyer. Technical buyer in that whole contract was very well established. You got a spec, you made a proposal, there was this, there's that, you went around. It's very hard to break that. But we were going after a completely untapped market of people that had an idea. I remember one, and I was told this by the team, so I didn't experience it myself, but I remember one incident where there was a kid who came to our booth once at an event. He must have been like 9 or 10. And he wanted to build something. And then there was another gentleman walking past saying, what's this kid doing on your booth? We're like, well, he wants to build this. And apparently the story went along the lines of, oh, well, I'll fund it. I'm not sure if he ever did in the end. But to me, that whole, even if it's just an analogy, it's like, there's so much magic in that.
It's incredible to see just, where Builder went from the 2016, like I remember like when you guys were launching, right? And obviously you had a few challenges kind of along the way. We're going to shape the story up a little bit. If I think for the audience, anything in between kind of 2016, 24, they can read elsewhere because you've done quite a few interviews, right? But let's jump to 25. And I think this is, this is why we're here. And like I said earlier, I think it's really important to be super honest and for founders, hopefully, to learn as much from you as possible. So when 25, we've created all these moments of magic. Builder.ai is a couple hundred people now, even more than that, right? In terms of people, 900 at this stage. I remember reading this story, 2019, there's this article which came out, right? AI startup boom raises questions of exaggerated tech savvy. As a founder, and we're in the media business, when you get attacked, and it's not happened too often to us yet, but when you have stories like that, it's probably super, super painful. When that article came out, how did you, control yourself, but also not get super frustrated?
Well, I think, that was my first real experience of negative media in the grand scheme of things. And, up till then, at least I had the slightly rose glass view that what you read is really what happened. One of the things I've really learned in Builder through the journey has been what you read is rarely what happened. And so now when I read stuff, like I ignore 90% and I don't read the headlines anymore, because usually if there's going to be any truth, it's going to be buried somewhere in the middle or in the bottom. And I think, look, that's just how the media business part has just evolved. When the Wall Street Journal thing came out, I remember a group of us sat together and we're like, what on earth is this? Like, we're irrelevant. We had just, because I guess it was like end of 18, beginning 19. We had just raised a round to go build the platform. And like, we're going through our investment deck. We're going through the investment memos produced by our investors. And they're in sync with what we've said, which doesn't say it's built. It says that, so it goes back to those, I think it was 8 or 10 bubbles. It's like, we're only like 30% of the way there. Now, is it 20 or 30? Look, God knows. Very different to saying we're 100% of the way there. And it was super frustrating. And then we realized it was motivated much later. It coincided with, let's just say, other activity that we were unfortunately having to deal with, that I don't wish upon any founder to have to deal with, and departures that we didn't want to have to deal with. And we kind of realized shit is not all as it seems. But look, my general approach to these things, you take the positive from it. The positive from it was we made sure 1000% whatever we wrote, we overemphasized, hey, listen, it's human assisted. Like, if you look at our website, even when we started launching CodeGen, we always said like humans going to be in the loop. And we explained where, and when you went through our checkout experience, it would say weeks. Like, if it was all going to be an AI, why would it take all weeks? Granted, it might take a week. Ain't going to take 12 weeks, right? And then we split up pricing. Here's the platform, and like, here's customization. Customization is done by an expert network. And it's machine calculated price. So sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong, but the customer never paid more. So we became so focused on the under marketing in some respects. Like, we would almost, like, every time we make an adjustment or a change, we'd have multiple people look at it like, is that right? Have we over blemished it? Is that too much over blemished? Like, do we need to be really careful on the wording used here? And even when, we had we were so excited because we had like version 0 of CodeGen running that could run on top of the building blocks. When we were pushing that video, showing code, showing everything else. Like, we were still paranoid from the scars of 2019 that, like, is this going to be misunderstood? Are people going to think it's already into production? And, and we were doing ourselves a disservice because everyone else who hadn't had that limelight, like, they'd have 1% and they'll show they have 100%. Here, we had like 70%, 80%, and we were preconditioned to show like we had 30% or 40% in some cases. In other places, we might have been really wildly optimistic. But when you become a company of that size, it's virtually impossible to check every single thing. And so, at least in my own world, I became really, really paranoid about diligence. So I was like, got to make sure we get tech DD. We got to make sure we get all of this stuff checked. And you know what? Like 100 filed patents later, 20 granted patents later, a number of PhDs working in the team, like, we built a real platform that was way ahead of its time. And, the scathing story of the 2019 article, unfortunately, put a cloud over our heads. Do I think we ever shook that cloud off? No. Did we get moments of light breaking through? Yes. But I think the virtuousness of whatever created that cloud didn't ever leave us and sort of followed us as we followed our own journey. And so to me, that was like, just, it's like shit happens, but you use it as a lesson to learn from.
So many of these events, whatever you want to call them, they always happen in startups. And it's one of those things, whatever's written in the media, normally they would, of course, always do reference checks, but they don't work inside the company. So I think you have to decide which story to take, right? Or which side to take. But what I would love to talk about also is, so with 2025, and this is maybe, and it's only last year, so this is still, quite fresh. And I'm going to let you just tell the story. It's in around February, I think, and things maybe start to, unfold. What is happening inside the company? And, when did you start to realize maybe things, are going in a slightly different direction where you had anticipated?
Look, I think last year feels like a decade in that sense. Because, the hours were what were normally days were hours, what normally hours were minutes. And so, it all multiplies out. Maybe the reverse of this is, like, I think about the role of the entrepreneur or the CEO as the captain of a ship. And the voyage is the journey. The captain controls the voyage. But the captain doesn't go to the engine room and check every dial. The captain doesn't check how much fuel is in every tank. The captain, doesn't check every single navigational equipment is working fine. There's an escalation chain at which point stuff gets highlighted. And, I want to start by saying, I think, and I said this sort of to whoever asked, it's very important to understand that the success was the team's success. The failures were mine. And it's because I was captain of the ship. But the failures that were mine are very different to the failures that were narrated. So let's start with the failures that were mine. My belief, I still think it's the right belief, but maybe we didn't have the right approach to it, was that you had to build end to end.
What do you mean by that?
So, at Builder, we built our own meeting platform. We built our own whiteboard platform. And there were discussions about this, but we wanted to capture every moment of input, because the belief was if we got every single moment of input, we had all the right training data in modern parlance to build the right thing. And we weren't getting that training data when we were using third-party systems. So the base case for us is we had to build wide to cover the entire software development. In hindsight, there was probably an alternate way to do that. The second is when we started to see acceleration, which is kind of around COVID, interestingly. we just grew too fast. Like I think we went from, $300,000-$400,000 a month to a few million a month in like, it felt like a split second.
And this is in revenue.
In revenue. And and so the problem is, there is an ordinary pace at which you can build systems, people, organization, governance, like what have you. We just stripped that apart. Like the top of the company was sprinting now, and you had effectively got on the hamster wheel. And so when we needed a break, like I don't think I was firm enough that we needed a break. The ideal thing would have said, guys, like whatever it is, we'll take the valuation hit, we'll do whatever we need to. We need a year, or we need 6 months. And so what happens in this is all cascading, right? So the thing is, none of these one items are a problem. You can build too much and everything else is great. So you got too much, too fast. Then not enough checking, which is a product of too much, too fast. And, the big takeaway for me was when the bird on your shoulder says, something's not right, you've got to listen to it. And, the conventional wisdom was you delegate and then, people will deal with it. The problem is that often those people don't have the full view. And so, I remember in the middle of all of this, you had that founder mode essay that came out. I don't think that's that far off, huh? Like, I think there's a balance. So then it comes to the topic we discussed right in the beginning, which is trust. I just trusted I put the wrong emphasis on trust. So let me unpack that a little bit more. So growing up, I didn't have like the best relationship with my father. And why am I saying that? Well, I'm not saying it so that people can bring out their violins and play a sorry story, but things that happen to you as a kid, or things that you experience as a kid, your connection with other humans, your connection with your family, your parents, will have an impact on you as you grow up. So my impact was, number one, I always wanted to be liked. So I'd never do anything that made sure I wasn't liked. I needed everyone to be agreeable. It would do my head in if folks weren't agreed. So end of a meeting or what have you. Especially where I thought it mattered, right? And I got a bit better at it over time, but not good enough. I considered it a green flag when someone said, "You're like family, I got your back, you've told me it's fine." That's a red flag now, in my mind. It's when you have a vacuum, remember, it will get filled up. Choose what you let fill it up with. It's wrong English. Choose what you let fill the vacuum gap. And that red flag, green flag was really important. In my ordinary course of life, if someone said, well, quote unquote, we just got to figure out how to put a lipstick on a pig, I would just never allow that. Like if my kids ever said that to me, or someone in the family ever said that to me about a situation, I'm like, no chance. There is no lipstick going on any pig. And when you're trusting folks that you shouldn't be trusting, and then you have statements like the whole thing, and you're going too fast, and you're building, like it all starts to cascade. And you then have this fear of ripping off the bandage. So there were people we should have let go of. And I felt like this emotional attachment to them, that I owed them the duty of care to lift them all the way through. And so what happened was I ended up doing their work. And when I would do other people's work or help them because it was a genuine problem, I thought I was helping. Conversely, I was making the other person either irritated, frustrated, or nervous. I remember this one incident. I ended up sitting next to a software engineer. We need to solve this problem with something. It was an algorithm issue. And I was genuinely just interested to help them. I'm an engineer by profession, or by background, sorry. And so I was actually quite excited. Like, sit and code after many years of being so far away from it. And this guy was mortified. And, to me, I never see he was mortified. I found out after the fact. But it goes back to something I said earlier on, which is the impact of your actions are almost very rarely what you wanted the impact to be. And I think that became a really interesting sort of mind shift for me. And so you start questioning your decision when you hear the feedback afterwards. So, shit, I didn't mean that. I was trying to help. Because in my mind, we'd not shifted away from 20, 30 people sitting around a table. I was like, I'm in the same journey as you are. My job is to make sure you succeed. And it's better doing that than firing you or ripping off that product. And I'd say that the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back was the noise. And, the rubbish about 700 Indians or no AI, and probably that got me the most wound up that I've ever been wound up, because of what happened in 2019, and because we were so focused and we'd done so much work and we'd built so much, and yet no one was even questioning, and they were writing gibberish for all intents and purposes, which incidentally is why 86 publications have taken down the fake AI nonsense without even just a letter. The nonsense around round tripping, the rubbish around the India situation, which is also now being cleared up. And it just felt like you were in paralysis. The best analogy I give folks is, it's like, imagine you are running in slow motion and the world is going in the opposite direction at the speed of light. And so, and the understatement would be, it's like being a deer in headlights. And so what happens when these things cascade, especially because you end up trusting the wrong people, is you let layers develop. The vacuum always gets filled. So you let a layer develop. And unfortunately, and to me, this is a huge mistake. If you're a founder and you raise money from someone, you don't let a layer develop with you, with that person. Good, bad, or ugly. Because the minute you let the layer develop, you get multiple versions of the truth. We know that history has multiple versions of the truth, by the way. Like, it's, you go and ask a child in Delhi or London or New York about, I don't know, let's pick a complicated topic, British independence. That's right, Indian independence, British independence. Indian independence. There are 3 different versions of history taught in those 3 different places. And so you let a vacuum develop between you and your board and investors, and you let folks meet in the middle. Well, you no longer control the narrative. And it's super hard. And actually, in my opinion, I was a coward to do that. To me, it was the anxiety of not being liked on the difficult conversations. And shit, man, if you took the job, you gotta deal with the not being liked. And I should have known that as a tennis player, because it was the input that mattered in that situation, not the output or the outcome. And I remember, I'd asked for a slowdown. We negotiated 6 months, which I still thought was a little bit less. Then it got brought down to a quarter. And then like a month into it, everyone's like, why have we slowed down? I'm abbreviating a lot of conversation. And then, no, we need to speed up. Like, we're spending money and so on and so on. I was like, well, we're back to not solving the problem. And I think anxiety is such an important thing to manage for a founder, especially in being able to have the difficult conversation, because shit's going to happen. And the solution can't be that you'll go fix it. And the solution can't be that you can't have that difficult chat, because what's happening is, I have a lot of black hair now. I had a lot of gray hair because everything was on your head.
It's super hard. And that's the thing about being a founder, right? Being, back to your words earlier, the captain of the ship. Everything's on your shoulder, and it's super difficult. Going back to the friends who we said earlier, right? Who we trust, who can you call? But there are two things you mentioned earlier, which we should just clear up. So one is the team members, employees, whatever you want to call them, in India. All these engineers, right? 700 engineers.
We never had 700 engineers. Let me correct that back.
So
we had like 700, 900 people globally.
Okay, so you had 900 people globally, and I've read all the podcasts and I've seen all the interviews, right? So, what is the makeup of the whole organization, and where's everyone based?
I mean, again, it changed a lot, but like in the peak, you maybe had like 50, 70 people, 50-ish people in the US. You had about 200 and something people in London. You had 50, 60 people at peak, I think, in the UAE or in the Middle East. We had a small, tiny team in France, a few folks. We had a big team in India and a small team in Singapore. And like with the very rare exception, except obviously customer support, our teams never did customer work. Our teams are building our own platform. Like I think at the peak of Builder, we only had about 200 people in engineering and product. So the fact that there were apparently 700 people pretending to be an AI, which by the way, is technically impossible considering how fast Natasha responded. And our cloud bill should not have been what it was if that was the case. Nor our consumption bill of models. I think it was like so distorted. And like if you follow the story, right? That story, you get some paid for publication writing it. Then you get a bunch of crypto blogs in Hong Kong that have never written about AI. The article's written by the same guy that's written 3 other things. Syndicates to Binance. Suddenly gets blown up. Then you have this chap in Switzerland who gets quoted, Bernard Engelbrecht. If you Google him, it's not very flattering. But anyway, he's a crypto dude. And he says, Natasha has no neural network, has 700 Indians. Well, if you look at the rest of his posts, they got like 50 views, 60 views. Magically, this one has like 300,000 views. And then you have like the media quoting him like he's an AI expert. And no one's stopping to ask like the question, should we just go search Google patents? Should we go see what the team's makeup is?
Or did these journalists ever write out? Did these journalists ever reach out to you?
No.
Okay, so we've cleared up the team. And I mentioned the other people in India and like Southeast Asia, I think it was. These are like customer support.
No, we had customer support. We had sales. We had finance. We kept a lot of like the central functions in India because it was just inexpensive. Yeah, it's just inexpensive.
And we all know that, right? Okay, combination. And then the second thing you mentioned earlier was around the forecasting and numbers, right? In terms of revenue, if I'm not mistaken, that's what you meant. Let's clear that up. So, what you reported, was that accurate or inaccurate?
So I think it's more complicated than a one-word answer. So firstly, there was this whole news around round tripping. So round tripping is basically saying, I will give you some money, you give me some money back, no work's going to get done. That's basically round tripping. Round tripping is not, we charge you $83 million worth of work for work done over several years. And then, by the way, we need to spend on marketing, so we're also going to spend it on your platform, and you're actually going to give us ad reports so we can see the links and everything else. It's a little like saying, you've kind of seen this, right? Where a big chip company invests in a big model company, which invests in a big portfolio manager, which tells its startups to buy from the model company, and then the model company buys chips from the chip company. It's also not round tripping because real work's being done. And in this particular case, what was just astounding to me was you had 10 years of audit history with Deloitte and this customer of ours, clear. But you still wrote the stuff. Like no matter what we said, you said, oh, but it is alleged this, but they said this. I'm like, what's the point of writing the alleged when like it's so clear? And then early investors did their own diligence. I did my own forensic diligence. Just questioning, like, have I got it wrong? And it all came out clear. Like, I remember in this one report, that the company had done, it was like, it's said we were given 68 gigs of data to analyze to come up with our conclusion that there was round tripping. Footnote: we did not look at 68 gigs of data. And so you had all of this, like, no software was built for Verse, is what some employee said. Footnote: we did not verify whether any software was built or not built. So I was like, dude, like, what is this investigation? The facts of the matter are lots of software was made, lots of advertising was used. You could argue, did we get all the results we wanted out of the advertising and marketing? No, but we didn't get all the results out of ad spend we did elsewhere. That is an optimization problem, not like we made shit up to get something done, right? And then you get down to changing in revenue recognition. So, it's so easy to say, oh, like, well, you misstated revenue. Didn't misstate revenue. But you change the policy of how you do recognition, but then you're going to restate revenue. If, for example, you had a contract which said, policy which said we're going to recognize revenue when signing a contract. And you have another policy a year later which says we're going to recognize it evenly with the period of the contract. Then you have another one which says another adjustment to it. We're going to recognize it when it's paid. But there are 3 different revenue recs. None of them are wrong.
It makes sense.
Right. And I think that's the point, right? And what was to me was just astounding was like, you on one hand, you have a newspaper which says we collected 100 million in 2024. And then you're saying the revenue is half of that. Like, who collects twice their revenue? Remember, I left the company in beginning of February. All of these restatements and changing in policy happened after I left. And so all I have is what you have. And all I can tell you is by having looked at the policy changes, good example. In software businesses, you have this concept of unbilled revenue, especially for enterprises. We're doing the contracting process is not finished. The customer wants a piece of software before. So we would recognize it when we started doing the work. But we would mark it as unbilled. But you still recognize revenue. It's very normal. Now, if you change the policy to say, we're no longer going to have any unbilled revenue, what you're doing is you're shifting it out of 1 year, say 24, and you're shifting it into 25 when you got the contract signed or when you got paid, depending on whatever you set the policy to be. But you also got to realize the statement, we collected 100 million in cash in 24. How can you collect 100 million in cash, assuming you're going to have at least 90 days AR? And the thing is, it's, when the narrative gets ahead of the truth and when it's motivated, then you don't know what you're reading anymore other than conjecture.
It's super hard. Yeah, it's super hard, especially when, depending how you classify revenue, right? And this is for every SaaS company, it gets super hard. And I think that's, fair to say.
And we weren't SaaS, Ollie. That's the thing that people forget. We were this middle ground. We were a whole new model. This is where the chaos was. We were selling you features, but we were giving you a copy of the code. So we couldn't be SaaS. Right. And then we had it wasn't weird, but it was unique licensing policy, which says you can only use this feature for this application. And why did we have that? It was so obvious, right? Because if somebody could come to us and say, build me Builder, take all of our reusable features and go build a competing platform. So we had to license the feature to only be for an instance of an application or an organization or something or the other. And so you had a bunch of things that it was a quirky model. It would have been much easier to say paid $10,000 a month.
It's also back in a day where none of this stuff really existed, right? I mean, you guys kind of were one of the first to market. There may have been some other categories at the time and other companies. Okay.
Well, yeah, look, imagine, Ollie, there was no token model, right? So there was no charging for tokens, which I just find mind-blowing because an average customer doesn't know why they're consuming these tokens. And actually the beauty of consuming, the beauty and the irony of consuming the token model is like saying, I'm going to consume gigawatt hours. But what does that actually mean? Like, how much software am I going to get? How long is the TV going to run for with that? And then you're saying I'm selling to a non-technical user. So it's an entire about turn.
Exactly. Okay, we've cleared up a few things then. What I do find pretty amazing about the story is you guys raised a lot of cash and pretty quickly, $450 million. What were you, maybe there's two questions there. One, what's the greatest lesson you learned for founders when you went through that fundraising process? You raised from some of the greatest investors out there, Microsoft, SoftBank. I think in one of your interviews, you actually had a whiteboard meeting with Massa from SoftBank. What's the greatest lesson you learned during?
No. I presented to Massa eons ago in a prior company when I was 21, and it was the most frightening experience of my life, but nothing to do with Builder. I never met Massa. Son for that. I'd say that raising money was never easy, and it was definitely not easy because of the clouds that we had from the original 2019 story. Like, it just became harder, right? People would, you'd walk into half the rooms and people would just have a smile, and everything you were saying, you kind of knew was being doubted, and you were having to do triple the amount of work to effectively remove the negative, right? And this is where I learned, somebody said to me that, you can say something negative, then you have to say 10 positive things to cover the negative. So raising was not easy. It was a lot of work. There was a ton of DD, especially on the tech, which to me, again, about Circle makes this whole thing around the AI piece even more infuriating. Given that we had independent tech DD, investor tech DD, third-party tech DD, and it was tough. I'd say that, we were also between three different narratives, right? As things are going through, we started in the no-code, low-code narrative. We said, well, we don't think that's the right direction. This is the right direction. Classically, as all companies do, then you mold to the narrative. Then we were in the early generative AI narrative. And in the middle, you were basically in our own world where we said the world is going to be composable, and composable of reusable atomic units, right? Or restructuring AI, or reconstructible AI. And so raising was not trivial. It's not like you got 100 offers. But Ollie, I don't think it's even easier right now. Like I know of two vibe coding platforms. Well, I won't mention names. One raised at a multi-billion valuation, and one raised at multi-hundred million valuation, same revenue, same platform, still using the same third-party models. And so that really, when you look at it from the outside in, like you kind of see, right? It's not a perfect math formula. But what I did learn is that it's all about being relentless. There's a guy who used to work with me. He was akin to my chief of staff, and he and I, like, when we were fundraising or when we were meeting, like, we were relentless. It would be 14, 16-hour days. We'd be falling asleep. We'd be having espresso, going into the next meeting. And no one sees that. No article's writing that. No article's writing that, you're doing 100-hour weeks, running around like a headless chicken, not seeing family, not seeing your children as they're growing up. Because it was just a pursuit. It was like, I need to make sure we do this. And, he and I and a couple of others, no matter what time of the day it was, I remember doing investing meetings at 3 a.m, or 4 a.m. You just wake up, red-eyed and like, need to get on with it.
The relentless hustle. That's what it takes.
Yeah. That's what it takes. There's no such thing as an easy fundraise.
Never. When closing this kind of chapter, when things started to, reach the end and you decided to step down as CEO about this time last year now, what were those conversations you had with your team, your investors, your partners, and also your family?
Look, I think the stepping down feels like an hour in a moment or a day in a week. But if I think back, like, I'd had discussions about this for a year with like my wife and others. And I was like, it's just, I'm not sure if I'm the right person. And, I think the thing here was like I transitioned to someone that, had effectively been, for all intents and purposes, pretty involved for the 2 years prior. And the reason for that was so that nothing got left, right? It was pretty consistent, despite what others might say. There was no, in my view, there was no form of management. Who was new was already in the past, different titles, different glasses, different jumper. But you can't have amnesia of the past. And I think what's really important was that transition was meant to be it's the right decision for the company. It wasn't the right decision for Sachin. It was the right decision for the company. And so, I did what I thought was the right thing to do at that time. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't have done it that way. But, hindsight's a great tool. It's 20/20 vision. I need glasses already. so it's a little bit different.
It's one of those things, take us back to those last 12 months. And I imagine there's a ton of pressure on you personally. And all of these different thoughts once going through your mind, going back to what we said at the beginning, which is who can you call when things, get tough? Who are those friends? The last 12 months, how was that for you emotionally? And, I have to also look at this from an outsider, you're also a family man. You said earlier you've got 2 kids. This must have been pretty tough.
So look, I think my wife probably felt it more. Just how my brain works, I can compartmentalize a lot easier because also I know all the information, so it's easier to reason. My kids are little, so, every now and then I have to tell them like not to wear a Builder swag or something or other, but I figure out a playful way of saying it because they need to move on in their own minds. We definitely found the stronger roots that we could lean on, and we weeded out, or got weeded out, the ones that you couldn't, and you can read all the lines in between that you want. I realized that there's stuff you can control and there's stuff you can't control. I think the thing that to me was the hardest was I had just not been accustomed to betrayal. I always just believed that if you were just really nice to people, it would be really hard for them to throw you under the bus. I realized in 2025 that's not the case. And you know what? It's a lesson better learned at 40 than learned at 60. And I remember this one conversation, it was, with a certain individual who said, success for me is after I left, success for me is you being CEO again in 3 years or something like that. So I'm not sure, but, if it's you or me, it doesn't make a huge difference. And that, I might need to throw you under the bus every now and then because otherwise it'll just look like, I'm Sachin's guy. I said, look, you got to do what you got to do. And I understand. And then when you would see the things happening in I'm sitting in a meeting and folks are saying things, I'd be like, so wait, is this the bit where I'm being thrown under the bus so that a relationship can be formed? Or is this the bit that I'm actually being thrown under the bus? And it's like, what do they call it? It's not manipulation. It's, I'm going to sound really bad when I say this, but it's like grooming someone's thinking. And, you end up creating so much hysteria in their mind that just don't do anything. And then I'd go out of the meeting and I'm like, well, so the first hour I'd be enraged at myself for being quiet or not saying when I had all the information. And then I felt like, well, I'm a total sucker if the platitudes and everything else cover up, the things that didn't work out. But you know what, Ollie, everything happens for a reason. It's a great time to be alive. You can do what you want to me. You can't mortgage my mind. People still read what I write. The stuff that I'm writing about how AI is changing, the conversations I have. I'm just happy to be 10 people again and building as fast as we can build seeing something execute really quickly, getting to, you start laughing, but getting to hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue. It's a great time to be alive. And to be honest, it is what it is.
It's one of those things where, and again, thank you for coming on the show. I think it's really important we share those lessons. I think in life, we're always going to have people who hate us. When stories like this come out, there will be angry people, but then there will be hopefully some of your, fans still there somewhere.
Well, the thing I found most interesting was the people that were really angry with the people that had nothing to win, nothing to lose, nothing to gain, but they needed a LinkedIn post.
Yeah.
Because they were going to tell my story without even speaking to me. And then I had others, including a lead investor, he said, if anybody asks you, you should say, you ran fast, learned a lot, moved on to the next adventure. Now, this is someone that had something to lose. So what does that tell you?
Do you think, on that note, if this was very much a US company, US culture is fail fast, ship fast, just move on. Do you think it would have been a very different story?
Well, it actually, interestingly, it is a US company. Interestingly, it is a US company, but, headquartered in London. I don't know. I think, it's a dangerous area to speculate in. And I'm not sure if there's any benefit in it. What I'd say is so much of Builder's problem and Sachin's problem at Builder was the noise. It's like going into a boxing match with your hands tied behind, one hand tied behind your back, if not both. It's hard enough to do the boxing match. And then if you're overweight and you're slightly slow, and then you have your hands tied behind your back, and then you realize that your coach is not on your side, and then you realize the guy that, did your gloves and the weights around your gloves was tipped off or paid off or what have you. Shit, it's an impossible battle. And it's hard enough to do a company without all of that. It's just hard enough to get product market fit and sell without the drama.
I agree. Maybe one of my last questions is around the last 12 months. You've learned a ton, right? We'll talk about more about building what you're up to next, but the last 12 months has probably been mentally challenging, probably learned a lot. It's probably been really good for you in some respects as well. What do you think is the greatest lesson you've learned about yourself in the last 12 months?
People over posters. You hire for loyalty to mission. That's it. No layers between you and who you raised from. Provenance by default. Write everything down. Confirm it. Document it. You don't know when it's going to be helpful. And then the other one, which is back to that tennis thing I'd said to you, space over pace. Find the right place to hit, not just go fast, fast, fast. And slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
How are you thinking about pace for your next company? And what are you up to next? When I hear these stories, although everyone's going to have their own opinion, and that's fine. But we're talking, face to face now. And when I hear these stories, I often think these types of founders are not going to go away. They're going to come back and build something amazing. And you kind of highlighted you're building something. So what are you building on now? And why should we be excited?
So look, it's called Second Brain. And really it's this eureka moment in my own mind of, well, what is intelligence? Intelligence is meaning and reasoning. Take emotion aside for a second. Today, what we have with language models is just reasoning or proxy to reasoning. There's not real meaning behind it yet. And you can tell that, right? Because they don't know what they're saying. They just predicted the next set of words. So to me, it was like a couple of things. So the first hypothesis is we spend about 3 hours a day looking for stuff. What if we could bring that down to 5 minutes? The question is, why do we spend 3 hours a day looking for stuff? The reason is all our systems are files. All the language models that we're using are all token-based, so syllables. But our mind works in ideas and concepts. So what's a file? It's a selection of concepts in an order. What's an email? A selection of concepts in an order. And what if we could build a digital version of your brain, grounded on all your files, all your emails, all your chats, all your conversations, all your AI notes or your handwritten notes, what have you. And then you have 4 surfaces, right? You can ask a question, get an answer, grounded in your truth through 50 years worth of email, 50 years worth of documents. But the beauty is it will connect the dots across the different artifacts. There's Canvas. So it's like a notebook, which is auto-generated for you. So you can explore organizations, people, concepts, and their interrelation between them. This Kit from Knight Rider, where you can build agents and software that run on your intelligence. And then really we haven't named it yet, but sort of let's call it X for now, which is a future where when you go to a website and you talk to an AI, it knows your context. So it bridges the knowledge from what you already know. And the core mechanic, Ollie, behind all of this is, and I give you this analogy. Imagine a world where you have this puzzle of the Serengeti. So you have the sky, the stars, you have the sky, the trees, the sun, the animals in the ground. And you throw all the pieces on the floor. The language model tries every single combination of the puzzle. And so you could have, the head of an elephant connect to the trunk of a tree just because it matches. We know that's a hallucination. Or you have a large concept model which says that's an animal, that's a tree. They can't be connected. That's what we're building. And ultimately, the goal is how can we build the cognitive layer or the cognitive operating system for both AI and humans to build a run on.
It's exciting. Sounds exciting.
Super exciting. And look, I think, to your earlier point, why tell this story now? It's because a comeback isn't a headline. It's a pattern. You make mistakes, you own the mistakes, then you go back to building. You do it with more humility, tighter governance, and a clear philosophy of what is intelligence. And, the big takeaway for me out of all of this is ambition must be tempered by accountability, and that can still move the world. One verified step at a time. And we're doing that in how we build a company, and we're doing that in the platform we're actually building.
This is why I wanted to have you on the show it's only fair to give, founders the chance to share kind of, what's happened. So, it's been amazing hearing your story. We talked about trust earlier, and finding trust in people is really hard. But I'm actually going to reverse the question. You've been through a ton in the last 8 years, give or take. Why should founders and people trust you now? And why should we be excited? What Sachin's going to build next?
Look, I think that's a really important question. And to be honest, it's a very hard one to answer. Because I can give you 100 reasons. So could an LLM on why you should trust someone that's had a mistake or has gone through what I went through. But I guess the question is going to be, judge me what I do next. And the fact that I'm back on the saddle, proverbial saddle, with a group of folks that were there before, who all came in with seriously discounted compensation to what they were earning, who are deeply motivated to make this succeed. Tells you everything. And I'd say the other thing is I know the mistakes I made, but they're not the ones being written in the newspaper. So,
Well,
The trust has got to be coming from whether you want to read the newspaper or you want to know about the mistakes actually made.
Well, we all love a comeback story. And again, thank you for taking the time to share the story. Like we said, this is the first episode and podcast you've kind of done, since everything happened. So people can make up their own mind, what they believe. Thank you. And we can't wait to see where, you go next. We love a comeback story and we can't wait to see what you build.
Thank you very much, Ollie.